to lend money. That for the individual bureaucrat at the World Bank, at USAID, at the Swedish Development Agency, for the individual bureaucrat, their promotion, their salary increases depend on getting money out the door. Well, this works pretty well. We have some countries that need a lot of money, that just need currency. They don't need particular projects necessarily, they just need foreign currency. They need US dollars. They need, at the time, German marks. They need British pounds. They need meaningful foreign currency. And then we have some bureaucrats whose careers will be made based on their ability to give large loans, to lend large amounts of money. So it's these two things that push toward structural adjustment lending, in which there are no specific outcomes on the ground that the money is supposed to finance. Within a structural adjustment loan, unlike the anti-poverty lending that had happened in the 1970s, the money doesn't necessarily build bridges, it doesn't necessarily dig wells, it doesn't necessarily put teachers in schools. The government gets this money. Well, what is the government expected to do in exchange? The government is expected to agree to a set of policy conditions, to agree to a set of reforms in exchange for this large transfer of money. This was something strongly supported by World Bank Vice President Ernest Stern, who argued three things. First, he argued that economic growth was being hindered at a very basic level by the fact that the poor countries of the world were not liberalizing their trade and investment regimes. They were not allowing for free trade, they were not allowing for free investment. Those constraints were preventing them from growing economically. So policy reform was needed. Second, he argued that these poverty alleviation projects that McNamara had brought to the bank beginning in the late 1960s and early 1970s were failing in their objectives, in their internal objectives, because of the poor macroeconomic conditions in the country. That it was fine to sponsor schools or to sponsor feeding programs or to try and build irrigation systems. It was fine to finance concrete outputs like that. But as long as there was massive inflation in the country, as long as there was massive balance of payments deficits that prohibited imports, it didn't amount to much. That you needed these large-scale policy reforms in order for those on-the-ground projects to meet with success. And then finally he argued that the World Bank's attempts to bring about such reforms through simple consultations with countries had not been successful. That putting down very large loans in front of the countries and trying to use those as a lever by which to bring about policy reform was needed. That the act of talking about these problems, the act of conversation, had been insufficient. So the first structural adjustment loans then are made in the spring of 1980. They are quite explicitly about trade liberalization. So a $55 million loan to Kenya to improve Kenya's foreign trade and industrial structure, and then a $300 million loan to Turkey in order to build Turkey's capacity to earn foreign exchange through exports, through industrial and agro-industrial exports. In part, this emphasis on exporting, on engaging in world trade, is motivated by the export-led growth that has been happening in East Asia at this time: South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore. So I'm talking about structural adjustment, and I'm about to link it to the Washington Consensus. I want to stress the time period in which I'm talking right now. This is 1980. It's before the election of Ronald Reagan in the United States. It's before Robert McNamara has stepped down as president of the World Bank. Structural adjustment lending is devised under McNamara's presidency, and it begins under McNamara's presidency. Margaret Thatcher in the United Kingdom opposes structural adjustment lending because she opposes foreign aid in general. She says, we don't need to be giving larger loans, we don't need to be giving any loans. This is not the way that this history has come to be interpreted. But this is very much born under McNamara's presidency, sponsored by the Carter administration in the United States. It's before the Reagan Revolution in the United States, and Thatcher doesn't want to have anything to do with it. If you say the words Washington Consensus to somebody, that's not the world that they picture. That's not the first thing that goes off in somebody's head. Now, it changes pretty quickly because Ronald Reagan does get elected in November of 1980. He appoints as the new president of the World Bank in 1981 Tom Clausen, who is the head of Bank America, who is fairly conservative in his views on development. And he, even more importantly, appoints as the World Bank chief economist Anne Kruger, who is an economist based at the University of Minnesota at the time. And her most important article is a 1974 article about rent-seeking that says when the state gets involved in the economy, that leads to corruption, that leads to inefficiency, that leads to lots of bad things. This is the ideology that she brings with her to the World Bank. It's the ideology that spreads throughout the World Bank's both operations and research departments as she brings in other economists of a similar view set. And it is very much an anti-statist ideology. It is a belief that state involvement in the economy is not a good thing, that it leads to bad economic outcomes and therefore, to the extent possible, should be eliminated. So it's under this leadership at the World Bank and similar leadership at the IMF that the set of policies, a set of ideas that are commonly associated with the Washington Consensus develops. So what is the Washington Consensus? So first I want to describe the historical situation in which this term first emerges. It's associated with an economist by the name of John Williamson, and he's at the International Institute for Economics in Washington, D.C. And there's going to be a conference in 1989 about economic reform in Latin America, because the prevailing view is that the countries of Latin America have not been reforming, that they've not been engaging in economic reform. And the purpose of the conference is to kind of show, well, actually they have been, that the countries of Latin America are undertaking more economic reform than is commonly thought. And so what Williamson wants to do is he wants to establish what is economic reform. And he draws up a list of 10 items on which he believes there is consensus in Washington, D.C. among the representatives of the U.S. government and among the representatives of the major development entities based there, the World Bank, the IMF, to a lesser extent the Inter-American Development Bank. So Williamson is trying to record 10 policy reform objectives that he believes there's widespread agreement on, that they're good, and that he believes are already being undertaken in Latin America at this time. So he's trying to look backwards and say this is how countries have been reforming, and that there's general consensus that these are good reforms. Here's the list of 10. When people think about the Washington Consensus, they generally think about 3 of these. In general, people think about fiscal discipline, and they associate the Washington Consensus and structural adjustment policies with drastic cuts to government budgets. They think about number 8, they think about privatization, they think about ending state-owned enterprises and privatizing government utilities. And they think about number 9, they think about deregulation, and drawing on the US and UK contexts, they think about fairly extreme levels of deregulation, getting rid of safeguards, getting rid of any sort of government regulation. To a certain extent, that's represented in Williamson's ideas, and to a certain extent, that's not at all what John Williamson meant by these things in his list of 10 objectives here. So fiscal discipline absolutely is about not having large government